off from too much news, because there will always, you're not missing out. There will always be someone who will come to you and say, did you know what has just happened there or there? So you'll always be in the news, but you don't have to worry too much. That's my contribution.
Great, thanks, Jasper. Yeah, again, so you clarified that nicely for all of us, so I really appreciate that, and we now know exactly where to go. So I think we have to go across to Ed next. So Ed, over to you.
I was just thinking Trevor has too much time on his hands if he listens to all those different television programs. I have got quite a structured approach to news, I suppose. I listen to BBC Radio in the morning. It's paused at the moment because I understand where their bias is. Also, actually, on the radio, there's also the news quiz, which is like a radio version of Not the 9 o'clock news, which is quite good. And then when I want to, and that's just general news, but my main passion, as you probably know, is the environment and hugging trees. So I get most of my information there from Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund. But to make sure I kind of get a balanced view, I sign up for other newsletters that aren't my way of thinking. So, for example, I sign up to the Conservative Party environmental newsletter. I'm not a conservative, I'm on the opposite end of the political spectrum. I've signed up to the Sustainable Food Trust newsletter. That's sponsored by the meat and dairy industry. So I get a different view from what I get from the Vegan Society, because I know that everyone has got their own angles. So I kind of like try and get several angles, but I haven't got enough time to watch everything. So I just kind of could choose a few select ones. And then when I find something that really interests me, I use something which you guys may know about, may not know about, Google Scholar. And I use that to find the original piece of research. So if someone's saying, I don't know, goose fat helps your hair grow, according to the latest research, I go and find that piece of research using Google Scholar, read it for myself, and then draw my own biased conclusion from the results of that research. So that's my process to news, but I'm only really interested in the environmental stuff, so the rest can just wash over me. I can get it from the radio, quick listen in the morning, quick listen in the afternoon, job done.
Great, thanks, Ed. So yeah, so you're just as confused as the rest of us. So you get all these third-party inputs and then you filter them out with your own biases. So I mean, that's great. So, so I think, right, so Trevor Carty, I think we better come across to you next.
I did it again. I'm just so confused because if news stands for north, east, west, south, why wasn't it called SOWN, south, east, west, north? So, you know, I just stay away from the news. It's all rubbish.
Okay, so Trevor's directionally challenged amongst other things. So we've really got some issues on our hands this morning, I think, by the sounds of things. So right, Una, let's come across to you next.
Yeah, I struggle with the same thing in terms of not really knowing which news channels I can trust and which not. So I basically most of the time just don't trust any of them. I really do think that they've all have so one needs to know that they've got their own agendas most of the time, and all of us do. So we have our point of view or whatever we support in life, and that's sort of from that frame that we believe what we believe, and that they would probably report on what they report. So I think what helps me, or what I'm doing is to try and get a wider view of something. So I do go and try and listen to talks and stuff like on YouTube or whatever, where people discuss and then try and listen to people from different perspectives. And that just, if I do that, I've just picked up on so many other facts and things. And I think there's a lot going on that's not ever in the mainstream news. So sometimes it's a bit of a trick to try and figure out when it's just part of a conspiracy theory and when there's truth to it. And yeah, I think my answer would just be for myself is to always have a critical mind. Don't believe anything just on face value that people say, and try and read as wide as possible and find as much as possible information.
Thanks, Vina. Right, Steve, across to you next.
Morning, everyone. I think I'll agree with Ed and in their position. I think it's important to remain open rather than closed, and I do think media outlets specifically will cater more to closed than open audiences. In terms of the niche that I think Jasper was talking about, I've had to cultivate more and more of a critical, analytical perspective in myself, as I discovered early on in my adult life that I would far rather take face value than think a little bit further than that. And that's been helpful for me, but also just entertaining all the different paradoxes and different opinions and different thinkings, because I find that that can help just to continually break you out of your own echo chamber. So I don't really listen to much news at all in terms of media outlets, etc. Well, the only media outlet I listen to religiously is Wisdom Chats, and I come here for the news. Even then, I'm not entirely sure about all of your panelists, but that's okay. Oh, I knew it. I knew it. Trigger Trevor. But yeah, I think it's just it's important to try and cultivate a wider worldview and not just be stuck in your own narrowness. And it doesn't mean that you can't have convictions and stand in particular places, but I think your convictions have to be challenged and you have to be tested. And that is a somewhat ongoing process. One of the guys that I really look up to, he's talking from a religious perspective, but I think it works for all worldviews. He says if you build a worldview like a brick wall, and a couple of the bricks at the bottom get poked out by somebody, then your entire wall is threatened. And so you have to be careful how rigidly you build your worldview. But if you build your worldview like a trampoline, then it can really take some bouncing on. And it can take some tension and it can take some pressure. And so you have to be able to bounce a little and not be rigid like a brick wall. I know the old Taoists will also support that kind of wisdom in terms of how you grow as a tree. So anyway, that's my thinking on news.
Great, thanks, Steve. So you're also just bouncing around all over the place. Yeah, okay. So Cecile, let's come across to you next.
Hi. Yeah, I used to religiously read the Sunday Times, sit all Sunday and read the Sunday Times and catch up on all the news. And my radio in my office used to be between 7:02 and Radio 5. And I would listen to the news on the hour. And then, I don't know, sometime in the beginning of the year, I just decided, no, I'm going to look for just music, a station with just music. So I listened to Jacaranda. I found Jacaranda's got the most music. I've listened to Jacaranda radio station. They have a little bit of news updates every hour. I do on my phone get News 24 updates, which sometimes, depending on what I'm busy with, I would just check and see what's the latest on the News 24. So listening to music all day is good and uplifting for the soul. So I don't have to listen to negativity all day. And then sometimes if I have a chance at night and I'm not doing something else, I would listen to the Kyk Net Verslag, where they would talk a little bit about the different various aspects of COVID. But I I don't want to know about all the COVID every day and all the negativity. So I like to listen to the positive parts of the news and feed my mind with that.
Great, thanks, Cecile. Right, Donovan, let's get across to you next.
Hi, morning everyone. Yeah, for me, I thought to overcome biases and misleading opinions is to get the news from different sources. But then I realized it's a bit too much hard work, and you end up seeing the same news being recycled. They just add a bit of color here and there. So I was just thinking of what someone once said. It was Andrew Womack. He said, opinions are like noses. Everyone has them, and they normally have a couple of holes in them. So, our news is full of, the bias of people's opinions, and as time will show, there's, the holes in those stories that we are fed on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thanks, Donovan. Yeah, someone also once said to me, he said, there's no new news. Anything that changes are the names and the times, and occasionally the places, but everything else stays the same. So, what's the point in watching the news? Well, I don't know. So, Lee, what do you think?
Well, I love, so one of the things I love is newspapers, but I've sort of become more digital, and I subscribe to the New York Times. And I do that, and I love Edwards just says, he does the BBC because he knows their bias. So I completely understand where New York Times is coming from. Although it was fascinating to me, a missionary friend of mine said he just started dipping into the New York Times, and he said in this sort of shocked, way, it is so liberal. And I sort of did have to take a step back and say, well, I knew it was liberal, but really is it, and then it just, you realize your own bias is caught into that. But the reason why I love the New York Times and the reason why I love newspapers is not simply for the news, but for the opinion pieces. So I enjoy reading the thinking that somebody else has with great language. These journalists often have a great way of coining phrases and being eloquent in explaining their point of view. So I enjoy that. It stimulates my thinking, and it's often based on some kind of research or something. So that I find really interesting.
Your answer, so I just put us.
And then, so sorry, I was just distracted. And then I also I find people fascinating. And so one of the things that I've discovered is this, and talk about conspiracy theories, that there's this group, QAnon in the States, that believes that the Democratic Party is basically a ring of pedophiles, and that Trump is the savior, and his whole mission on earth is to free America and the world of this pedophile ring. And everything that he says is code for how he's doing in the mission. I mean, the frightening thing is that this group is growing and that Trump is acknowledging them as true Americans. But how fascinating. And so that's what I read and watch the news for, is just to marvel at incredible people and yes, I think, and the language. And then the funny stories that come out of out of the news. One of the things, sorry, I'm waffling on, but one of the things that I did as an exchange student when I was in the States is traveled with a family through the back roads of from Michigan, Wisconsin, Kansas, and we stopped at each little town and bought the local paper. And I still love that. I still will read the local news because you find the most interesting things about what people have done, you know, the best and the worst and the funniest of humanity.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, you have to like people to be able to do that. So yeah, some of us have got a challenge with it. But so Kevin, across to you next.
Morning, everyone. So, main question is, what's news? What is news? I must admit, I don't have any faith in the two main broadcasters over here. They're total bias. I tend to just limit myself to the headlines on those to see what's worth looking elsewhere for. I will look online at various news outlets, but then they're all different. You get one that will start with a headline about an earthquake in some forsaken place somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and another one will start with celebrity X divorces celebrity Y. So, you know, what do we want to read? You know, no two people want the same news, and no two outlets give the same news. But the only news I really go out of my way to look for is the travel news when I'm going somewhere. Make sure the roads aren't closed.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is it actually news because it happened yesterday or before? That must be history. It can't be news, so I don't know. So we've got to go across to the researcher to wind up the morning for us. Pumalelo, you must be dismayed by all these people who are disregarding all these fun, sources of information. So let's hear your thoughts.
Interestingly not, Ivan. I have a very interesting relationship with news. I think, let me put it this way. I consume very little news format type of information. I guess part of it has to do with the research and me, Ivan, in that I tend to read more reports, read more. So whenever there's a subject, I'll dig into it more from that direction. And that's how I tend to be informed about things rather than watching news. I watch very, very little news. In actual fact, some stuff get mentioned and I'm like, okay, I wasn't aware of that. What I can admit is that I have been watching a lot of Trump. But even then, it's not so much the news. It's so much that I'm fascinated by his character and trying to determine what were the inputs that led to such a character, that led to such. So I tend to come more from that perspective in consuming as much of the Trump that I consume. I'm going to try also not to analyze the news a lot today. I'll speak more from the question that Trevor had as to what do you watch and then what do you do in deciding which will work for you. So in my collecting of information through reports and other means, I tend to look at the source and try and put together a profile of some kind in my head of that source, because it tells me what the intentions of that source is, firstly. But secondly, what direction that source will tend to shape information towards. So for me, I always go to who's behind the information. That for me is always quite critical. That's why I'll at times say, I can anticipate what this person is going to say because I understand the nature, the character that they hold and what they tend to espouse to and how they tend to think. And more often that pattern tends to follow throughout. So that's how I consume information. I do look at the source. I do look at what are their intentions. I do look at what tends to be the pattern. The last thing that I do tend to do in consuming information is the net effect it has on me. So there's a certain person I espouse to be. And if the net effect of information either puts fear in my heart or makes me not like certain people, makes me feel down, I tend to run away from that kind of information, because I would love that as much as there's wrong in the world, there's evil in the world. For the sake of my own heart and my own mind and how I view people and how I interact people, I then try to protect that. I try to protect my view of people in spite of the evil in the world. So if the news are going to make me so negative about South Africa, I tend to cut that down, because I would love that in the midst of negativity, I must still remain positive, because negativity is not going to do much for me. So that's how I consume information, is the net effect it eventually has on me. Yeah, was it everywhere, Ivan? I tried to just explain how I work with information.
No, that's all good. Now, Trevor's just asking you if your crystal ball can decide what he's going to say next. So, yeah. All right. So we are. The comments are getting saucy and spicy, and all sorts of strange things are going around in the comments. But I'm not too sure where we're heading with all of this. But yeah, I must admit, from my personal perspective, I don't put much stock on the news at all. If you ever want to know what's going on, just have a conversation with somebody, they'll tell you, and then you can make up your own mind. You don't really need to watch the news channels or listen to the radio or read the newspapers. I haven't done any of that for years and years and years. So I scan the headlines now and again and see if there's anything that piques my interest, and then I might dive into it and do a bit of research. But other than that, I really don't put much stock or much value in the news myself. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Do we need to be informed? If we're going to be informed, how are we informed? Who's informing us? And what is the bias and the opinion of that information that we're actually getting? So it's an interesting challenge. And being analytical, I tend to look at things fairly critically most of the time, and try and work out, if I am going to look at it, where the bias is coming from, and whether I believe it or not. And I think that's, at the end of the day, what you've got to do. You've got to decide for yourself whether you believe it or not, and take it from there. Because as many of us have said, we all have our own filters, we all have our own biases, we all have our own perspectives and our views, and that's goes for everyone, journalists, editors, and us as individuals, and that's always going to color our opinion one way or another, I believe. So the question is, how much of it can we take away and filter out without bias? So yes, Steve.
I just had a question that I thought I'd pose for anyone interested to answer, in responding somewhat to what we've said and to some of what you're saying, Ivan. I think given the continuing democratization of information, what would you guys think? Is there a point at which people of a certain, let's think through whatever categories that might be, a certain education level, a certain intellectual, perhaps emotional maturity, whatever other categories we might bring it, that we transcend the idea of news and media outlets? Is there a sense in which we go into more sort of personalized research to find our own news? Because media outlets are not, from a research perspective, they are shocking in terms of like their sample sizing. It's not, like, here's this wonderful issue and we've polled 3 people who live in a hole somewhere in the middle of nowhere and don't know anything about the world, and so they're going to back up our agenda that we've already decided on, and here's the news. What would you guys think? Is there a point at which you transcend this idea, because it's no longer collating a bunch of information and presenting it to you in the world? Is it a transcendence? Is it just so, it's just fallen off the radar completely? Because it does seem to stir very much certain pots within the world. And there seems to be a lot of ignorance, sometimes willful ignorance out there. So what do you think in terms of that? Just was interested.
Yeah, no, I think a very interesting question and topic. So Trevor's clearly got an opinion on that one, so we better listen to his opinion quickly.
You better. And I'm going to try and influence Steve. Steve, did you watch The Social Dilemma? Have you had a chance to look at that?
Yeah, I watched it over the weekend. It was good.
Right. And the thing for me that stood out was how these nincompoops that were interviewed in that thing turned around and said, "Oh man, we've been manipulating people, and now we've got to redress all of this manipulation and influence." And I thought to myself, what a bunch of, I won't say anything. They've made billions out of it, and now they're turning around and saying, "Oh, we feel a little bit guilty, and we need to someone needs to fix the system." But they're okay, Jack. They made tons of money actually taking this high-tech manipulation. And I think what they've indicated is AI, filtering of news, can all be affected at the back there. So at the end of the day, we all have to go back to Mpumalela's strategy, and that is just try and use common sense to actually work out what works for you and develop your own opinion and watch out for what's being put out in the marketplace. So I think there's a big gap in wisdom's news. I think if someone's put an idea in my head, how do we come up with a wisdom's news channel that is actual truth, filtered from thinking minds? And we'd have to exclude Ed and Jasper out of this. We try and filter it out with our own form of AI. Did that help answer your question?
Yeah, that goes towards it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so just as long as everyone realizes that was just Trevor's opinion.
I'm trying to influence.
You're trying to influence. Yeah, your AI is not as powerful as Facebook, so you're going to have to work on your algorithms a little bit. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge. And I mean, you know, one of the initial theories about this whole social media and sort of democratization of information and access to information was the theory that we were going to get clean, unfiltered information, but of course that has proved to be completely wrong, hasn't it? So it's an interesting challenge. You know, how do you get to that point of something that you can truly trust and believe in? I'm not sure. Steve, yeah.
No, it's almost like the second formulation of the Gutenberg printing press, isn't it? Because now every man and their dog has the ability to try and put influence out there, regardless of their background, etc. So I just wondered if there were any other thoughts in terms of, you know, transcending the idea of there being sort of official news purveyors or not. I know I'm pushing the time here, so you're welcome to call it, but it's just an interesting thought.
No, I think it's an interesting discussion, and you know, if anybody wants to, you know, comment as well, I mean, please feel free to unmic. We're just chatting. I mean, I read an interesting thing about, I think it was one of the very first newspapers that were issued in the States in the 1690s. I think they put out their first edition, and their second edition was muzzled by the government at the time, and it's quite an interesting little article to read as to exactly what was said in that censorship of the very first newspaper that came out. So yeah, this problem is as old as time, unfortunately, as old as printing, certainly.
There's one word, and it's propaganda. He or she who controls the power also controls the message.
Yeah, you take that one level up. He or she who controls the money controls everything else. So yeah.
Which is why I want us to all go after all the money, so then we can control the world. Yeah.
Okay, I think this is spiraling off in all sorts of interesting directions. So you better wrap us up for the morning and see if we've got any thoughts for tomorrow.
Yeah, and the person or body that controls the algorithms, as it turns out, is especially on social media is what messages are predominating. And we know that as human beings, we are susceptible to subliminal and other messages. Advertising would not work if it wasn't the case that you just put a picture or a story or something in front of us, and it creates an association, and if that happens over and over and over again, then we will follow in that direction. But so the question that I would like us to think about tomorrow is our own thinking. I'm going to put it as simply as this: do you want to think? Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, because you're here because that's what we're doing, is we're challenging our thinking, we're inviting us to, the reason we ask each person to share is because we want to hear what you think, and that then infiltrates and speaks to our thinking, and we have to, we can agree or we can disagree, but at least we are engaging with the thinking process. And I want to, so this is my bias, is that there seem to be groups of people who choose to believe in something so wholeheartedly and with such passion and such. Now, I know I might be stepping on religious toes, and then we get, but I'm thinking more in the lines of conspiracies and even of opinions that this, and I'll give you my dad as an example, who I grew up arguing with my dad. And then I realized it was futile. I was never, ever going to change his opinion or get him to think differently or to see anything from any other perspective other than his own. And so what does it take? What is thinking? What does it mean to think? And yeah, I think that's as good as I can frame it at the moment.
Oh, I think I understand what you're wanting us to think, but I'm not too sure where the thoughts are going to take us. So, yeah, we'll have to spend some time deliberating on that one with our own thoughts over the next 24 hours. So, good luck with that one, everybody. Have a great day further, and yeah, we'll see you in the morning. Have a good one. Cheers.